Welcome to the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Norris. We're going to grow your leadership through neuroscience, psychology, and theology. Hi, everybody. Welcome to episode number 34 of the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. My name is Patrick Norris, and our goal today is to help you lead with a whole heart, a healthy brain, and a soul on fire. I'm so glad you're with us. In today's episode, Edwina Reyes shares how your disruptive emotions and behaviors can be restored through various therapies. Our topic is You're Crazy and how various therapies make a huge difference. Edwina is an expert and trainer in trauma, addiction, and all things related to compulsive and unwanted behavior. She trains state and national organizations such as the Department of Defense, Military, Community and Family, and the Department of Health and Human Services. Edwina also serves as the professional guest and mental health expert for TV channel KHON2 in Honolulu, Hawaii. Our conversation in this episode covers topics ranging from Edwina's abusive past to integrating Christ in church life into wholehearted recovery. We talk about the dynamic power of trauma, grief, and loss, exploring how both small griefs and large traumas affect us throughout our entire lives. We talk through how various therapies make a huge difference in returning to life-giving, wholehearted living. We even talk about how to find a good therapist. This conversation is interesting and helpful on multiple levels. You'll enjoy this inspiring, insightful, and engaging show. Before we jump into it, I want to invite you, your networks, and staff into one of our personal discovery experiences. Personal discovery experiences are 2-hour online events with me, a psychologist, therapist, and a group of 6 to 20 peers as we discover the roots that drive individual stories. These training events are designed for those who want to know what drives them and to be better equipped to lead those under their leadership. The next cohort, unique for someone struggling particularly with addiction issues, is August 31st. Our next Driven People cohort, designed for the general population, is September 3rd. And the Senior Pastors Driven Leaders cohort will be September 21st. Then the Church Ministry Staff cohort is September 28th. To find out more, go to redinkrevival.com. But first, if this podcast is adding value to your leadership in life, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to the podcast, like it, comment in the reviews at iTunes or YouTube, wherever you're watching or listening. Also, help us get the word out by sharing on your social media platforms, and thank you so much for doing that. Go to reddinkrevival.com and check out everything that we are up to. While you're there, sign up for our e-newsletter that'll hit your inbox the first of each month with a powerful blog post, as well as all our upcoming events. You can go now and sign up. Let's go now to this episode number 34 with Edwina Reyes as we talk about You're Crazy and how various therapies make a huge difference. Welcome, everybody, to the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. I'm so excited today to have a guest, Edwina Reyes. She's an expert trainer in trauma, addiction, all things compulsive and unwanted behavior. She holds a Master's of Counseling degree as well as a certification in marriage and family therapy. She's certified in trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy as well as eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing therapy. She's a member of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network and a co-chair for the Domestic Violence Collaborative Working Group. She has a really rich background in faith-based ministry that spans from serving in her local church to being a victim assistance coordinator for clergy abuse victims. She trains state and national organizations from the Department of Defense, Military, Community and Family, all the way to the Department of Health and Human Services. She's also a mental health expert for TV channel KHON2 in Hawaii. Edwina, it is awesome to have you on the show today.
Thank you, Pastor. Thank you for having me on.
Well, I want to start with, tell us just a little bit about your backstory and what motivated you to become a therapist.
Well, Pastor, back in the 90s, I worked actually for a church, local church here in Hawaii. And it was such an interesting experience. I really got my hands and feet wet working with the youth for the youth ministry. And I just loved it, just working with the youth. And we actually grew our youth ministry to second largest here in the state at that time period. But the painful part, I think, was seeing a lot of the youth, coming from broken families, abuse, struggling with addictions. And I think that began to stir my heart to want to be able to help in a way that was effective. And at that time period, there was so much that was going on at the church. I would watch families fall apart, unfortunately, affairs happen, all types of abuse situations going on. And it brought me to the point to decide for myself that I really thought if I wanted to be effective in ministry, I need to learn more. Hence, in my decision to then actually finish up my bachelor's degree in psychology and then move forward to actually pursue my master's degree in marriage and family counseling.
It's so awesome. I love how the Lord pivoted you simply by seeing the need and the depth of the need. And sometimes within Christianity, which, we are very pro Jesus, very pro Bible, very pro living out the Jesus lifestyle. But we can have over the centuries, we've given nickel and dime answers to $1 million questions. Absolutely. And we keep doing the same thing and maybe not getting any better results. And that, to me, is what you saw, that there were problems that needed some more insight, some more understanding. And you've applied your life to it, and you're making such a huge difference. Well, let's dig down into a bit of your faith backstory. You do have a love for Jesus. You are involved in your local church. You have a relationship with your pastor and his wife, and which, a lot of times you can get platitudes of people that will affirm their faith in Christ. But once somebody gets integrated into a local church and they actually know the leadership, it puts them in a different sphere. I'd love to hear your backstory of faith and how Jesus actually captured your heart.
Pastor, this goes more into my background childhood then, and I'll share. I'm glad to share, to encourage folks. I grew up not having any type of faith. However, my parents actually had me attend, a Catholic kindergarten and preschool at that time period, where actually that's when I started to actually learn about who God is and who Christ is. And when I didn't come to actually really know God and understand and find a church until I was actually 18 years old. When I really found Christ, or he found me, is probably the better way of saying that. And then he began to really teach me his ways. And as I got integrated into a church, I just started volunteering. And I think over the process of time, and it's been 27 years now since that time period, the Lord has really just taught me so much. The wounds of my past, I realized, I didn't realize how broken I was, prior to becoming a Christian. And I didn't realize, too, how much damage. I came from a background where I grew up where I had endured, a lot of physical abuse, by my mom growing up. And my own father as well, too. Growing up, he struggled with addictions. He struggled with a gambling addiction as well as porn addiction. So I was exposed to pornography. I was probably about 3 or 4 years old when I was actually first exposed to pornography, and it was on film reel. I mean, that's how long ago it was. And, so much unhealthiness in my family and growing up in that, and then also being a survivor of sexual abuse myself as well, too, when I was a teenager. I think the Lord just taught me a lot, and I just saw him just working in my life over all these years, teaching me, grooming me. And my initial plans actually when I was 18 years old was that I actually wanted to become a pastor, and I was actually being groomed by the church to go into full-time ministry actually back then. But God had different plans for me. I was groomed, I was being trained in that area, but he really changed the trajectory of my track of my life. And what he did was he actually brought me out into the secular world where I was learning more about child abuse, addictions. And not just that, Pastor, the most amazing thing is everything I learned on the outside, I was able to actually bring it into the inside and integrate things.
You bet.
And as time went on, what I ended up doing, and this just happened very naturally over time, was I took all the different things I learned, I merged everything, and then I was able to then take everything back into the churches here locally, some of our mega churches over here in the islands, and actually help to train leaders and pastors to really equip them. One of the things I think I really had a heavy heart about, and I have regrets in my life, was back then, early in the 90s, when I was doing heavy ministry work, I didn't have the training. I wasn't equipped. And so I dealt with so many situations where, I didn't know how to handle it or deal with it, and I kick myself today on certain things that I wish I had taken more action on, with girls who've been abused or raped, that I didn't. And so now when I look at the young leaders here today, ministers today, and upcoming pastors today, the biggest thing I think the Lord has placed in my heart now these days is to really equip the saints. And so that's been a big passion, desire of mine actually for these past, 10 years or so, to really bring everything that I have learned, that God has taught me out in the community and even nationwide, and bring it into the churches to help equip others as well too.
That is so, I love the journey. I love how you have began to explore like you have. It reminds me, as we've talked about, Dr. R.C. Sproul, he used to say, as a philosopher and apologist for Christianity, that all truth is God's truth. And he's saying that extra biblical truth is not something that arrived outside of God. That even though it wasn't something communicated in the Bible, it's still truth. So in the sciences, when we learn certain cause and effects, that it can be truth, even though it wasn't delineated throughout Scripture. And that is exactly what you're talking about. And I know, as you and I, we were privileged to go through some training around trauma and addiction together. We were privileged to make friendship as we went the journey. And I would sit in those modules in 140 or so hours of training, and I was like a kid in a candy store around the Bible, because the sciences began to unveil to me things that the Holy Spirit inspired the writers to actually write about as it related to human behavior, all the way to faith.
Absolutely. I don't know if you realize this, Pastor, or you came to this conclusion, like the more I learned, the more I realized it, especially when we're going through a training, the sex addiction training, is the more I realized actually the Bible actually became more life to me, meaning that that I realized even more so why Jesus said certain things even more.
I know.
As I learned more.
Which is so amazing when modern day neuroscience and psychology is discovering things that are actually written in Scripture for human health. And we just kind of read over it as this is a religious document, when God's like, there's a lot more in here for you than what you have maybe ever allowed. Which again brings me to this idea of trauma. Yes. And you are an expert in the area of trauma. What is it, and how does trauma affect people?
Trauma is such a fascinating thing. And I think that even until today, we're still learning really what it is and how it actually affects us, and it's really any type of event that occurs in a person's life that kind of comes in and it threatens a person's physical, emotional, or psychological well-being or safety. Yeah. And a lot of times too, when a person experiences an event, it can compromise their life or their body integrity as well too. And for some folks, depending on who they are and their makeup of who they are, it can going through a traumatic event can really affect their daily functioning as well too. They'll have a hard time sleeping, eating. There's a change and shift in their relationships. So it can be very, very debilitating for that person who's been affected.
Yeah.
So statistics actually show through SAMHSA, which is a Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Association nationwide, actually ran statistics that showed that actually 61% of men and 51% of women will experience at least one traumatic event sometime in their entire lifetime.
Yeah, yeah. So when you think of trauma, today you have everybody is learning to use the word trauma and are talking about, I had this traumatic experience, that one, etc. Does everybody experience trauma? You just said that 61% of men, 51% of women?
Yes, correct.
And that they have experienced it. So let's talk about that. Does everybody have trauma? Does everybody need therapy from their trauma? What's up with that?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. And I think a lot of that gets posed to me quite often is whether or not, should this person seek help? Or even I talk to so many ministry leaders as well too, and pastors, where they're like, okay, should I refer this person? Should I not? Right. And the answer really is that it really depends, to be honest with you. Although I would always say, and maybe I'm biased when I say I'm a therapist, and I think everybody can benefit from some sort of level of therapy and counseling support, at least sometime in their life. But traumas, not everyone who actually has experienced a traumatic event will actually need to go into therapy, actually. And it really depends on a couple of things. One is the resilience of the individual as a whole. Yeah. If the person has, probably a very good or maybe fair level of intelligence, they have a good support system, a great support system, that in itself can actually help them to overcome whatever obstacle or event that they've occurred, or intrusive event they occurred. But some, let's just say we have a person who's already had, let's just say, already prior multiple traumatic events that have occurred in their life, or maybe they don't have a partner support, or maybe they're not really tightly to a really local church, and they're just kind of hanging off by a limb by themselves. Absolutely yes, right?
Yeah.
Getting some sort of help that can benefit them. However, that's not necessarily the case. I also, counsel so many pastors and leaders and missionaries here in my office, right, who've gone through major traumatic events. They have a phenomenal marriage and support, but they just want an outside perspective, and they want more specific help on how they can overcome what they've been through.
Anytime I see somebody who is struggling with any emotions, maybe they are depressed, maybe they find themselves raging, they have this kind of fire up moment that they don't understand in their marriage relationship. They can't seem to adjust certain behaviors.
Yes.
Around emotional eating, all the way to porn, in sexual acting out, drugs, alcohol, whatever it is. Anytime I see any of those unwanted emotional experiences or behaviors, I'm always going to want to lean into the traumatic profile. And when we talk about trauma, of course, encompasses a lot of different aspects, but all of us have been in some way traumatized by sin. When Adam and Eve sinned and we are born into this earth, it impacts the way we see ourselves. It impacts the predisposition towards how we interpret the world and people around us. And then many of us have had these perpetrators in our lives, these moments, even in our family of origins, that didn't intend to create a grief story, but we built a grief story. When we talk about trauma, we're actually not just talking about some kind of an ambiguous, nebulous, invisible nothingness. We're actually talking about what happened to a human brain as it began to experience undesirable grief type moments.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So it is. It's a big part of who we are. So even the numbers of 61% and 51%, those are the ones who've identified that they have a legitimized trauma in their life. But I find, even in my story, I've never had an abuse story like many people would talk about, but I have had unwanted behavior, unwanted emotional experience that I continue to act out that really goes back to my grief story. And so I do think it's important that we always think about that and it be actually more normalized. Instead of, sometimes people on the street will be like, gosh, if I have trauma, then that means I'm a project. If I have trauma, that means that I'm abnormal. And I think I might even say, well, define trauma, and you have done a great job of that. But what if there is something happening there that doesn't get labeled in the definition of trauma, but it was such a deep grief story that your brain says, I have to protect, I have to armor up, I have to fight, flight, freeze out of this. Yeah. And so for you, when you think of all of this, what happens if a person doesn't lean into their story and in many cases receives therapeutic treatment for the trauma? What happens to that person?
It's a good question. And actually, it's kind of interesting what you brought up. And it brings a lot of things into my mind as you're saying that. The interesting thing about trauma is, a lot of people out there, there's some misconceptions on it. People kind of, and I kind of break it down like this. I teach a lot of folks I see is you have what they call big T and you have what they call small T.
Yep.
Big T are the large traumatic events that could occur in a person's life. Like, let's just say major car accident or, a domestic violence, like those type of very large traumatic events. But then there's also little T's, right, that can occur in a person's life. And for some people throughout their entire lifetime, so maybe they haven't gone through like sexual abuse or something heinous like that. But maybe let's just say if this, a boy went through school and all his school years, he was teased a lot or just picked on a lot. Or let's just say he was always picked last on sport teams in school. It was always a last one pick. It may not necessarily be big T, but it can cause these little T's, right? These events can really come in and even shape and affect the way a core belief and how that person sees themselves, right? Yes. And that is something that's also, in my opinion, also incredibly dangerous because that core negative belief that they begin to learn in their childhood, they bring that alongside with them into their adulthood years, into their Christian walk in faith, into their marriage, and even into their ministry when they serve others. So if they got the message, the small T message when they were young that I'm not good enough, that can actually be translated for all these other areas in their adulthood life. And again, until that comes forth and is brought to light and dealt with and healed from and processed, the person will always carry this ongoingly.
Yeah, I love the big T and little t, and then you get the aggregate of those little t's that build the same impact as a big T, trauma. When you're talking about this as a child moving all the way up to adulthood, it's interesting, and this is one of the things that we learned in our training, was that the way the brain processes pain and trauma is that if you're, let's say, a 5-year-old, when you experience an injury to attachment, and you are feeling this wound of somebody abusing in some way or a big grief story, when that happens as a 5-year-old, when you are, let's say 30, your brain is still processing in the tools and resourcing of a 5-year-old.
Pastor, we can even go younger. We can go at birth.
That's so amazing, isn't it?
We can go at birth because, and I'll tell you why, Pastor, because actually at birth already, the interesting thing is even though our hippocampus and our ability to remember and have episodic memories, it doesn't start till usually about 2 years old where we can actually remember events. The body actually clocks in and starts to remember, not just in utero, but definitely right at birth. So actually what goes on is the amygdala actually remembers from day one when you're born. So let's just say if you're a one-year-old, right?
Yep.
Very young, you're a baby, you're still a baby, really, an infant, and you go through some sort of traumatic event. Let's just say if you went through some sort of physical abuse. The interesting thing is that 1-year-old will not necessarily remember the event because the hippocampus has not been developed yet to get to that level of memory. However, it already has clocked into the body. The body remembers it. The body remembers that feeling of not being or feeling safe. Yeah.
And not only does the hippocampus, because it doesn't fully develop till you're around 15, but the areas of the brain that develop language, that hasn't been developed yet, hasn't grown. So when a person can be 30 years old and they have this affect response, this emotional experience, but they don't even have language to describe what it is that they're feeling because the neural pathway from the language centers had never been built because it happened before that part was even able to mature or be there. I love how you are framing all of that up. Because it can feel like, I know for me, for years as a pastor and a preacher, I thought that there was kind of psycho voodoo going on. There's stuff is just a bunch of touchy-feely, whatever. It was neuroscience that for me really began to give me objective handles around it. And it matters. It matters incredibly. And many people have been abused through their life and then they come to faith in Christ. and it's beautiful, and the new birth is transformational, and yet they still have these neurocircuits that fire up, and the shame-based emotional sense of self, and it is a heavy burden to carry through life. Talk to us a little bit about the difference maybe in childhood, teen type trauma, and then the adult trauma that people experience.
Well, like you were saying, development is so important, right? And, like you talked about the hippocampus, and then, even regarding full brain development, girls don't even have their brains fully developed until their, I believe, early 20s. And for boys, it's not until their mid 20s, right? That the brain even comes to that full development. And complex development of thinking or abstract thinking doesn't even start until a person is about 14 years old. So when you're talking about traumatic events at a child, right, definitely, right, they do not have the coping skills yet, within their brain or their body to be able to know how to manage it, And so, SAMHSA, again, like I mentioned earlier, recognizes about 2/3 actually of all children, unfortunately, are going to experience some sort of traumatic event by the time they are 16 years old. And there's also stats that are out that foster children themselves have they experience themselves at least 4 traumatic events, just in general. Kids in the youth that are in our juvenile justice system, I think, if I got this correct, I believe it's about 95 or 97% of them have been through some sort of trauma as well too. So the effects of trauma can start not necessarily we're talking about adulthood here. Actually, it's when a person's very, very young, but like I said earlier, you have the brain and the body not yet even developed, and you go through this type of significant event, and what it really is it's just maladaptive ways of coping. And so with teenagers, what you'll see is, you'll see them cutting, you'll see them wanting to take their own life, you'll see them being very promiscuous.
Yes.
Now these days, you have all those different apps that are out there. They're sexting, or they're displaying out nude pics. I mean, now these days it's being displayed, or they get addicted to pornography, drugs, alcohol, running away. I mean, there's so much different ways now because they can't cope, and they're trying to literally survive, that they're going to reach out and find whatever it is that can calm them down and ease them. But unfortunately, those things oftentimes are just not healthy for them.
Yeah. And it does seem that adult trauma often is more of an add-on module, to what their whole trauma profile is from childhood up. So even I know that we'll get into it in a minute, but Francine Shapiro, who is the curator of EMDR Therapies, which again, we'll talk about in a minute. But she wrote her book, Getting Past Your Past, and working with soldiers who returned from Afghanistan, Iraq, so on, with PTSD, real legit PTSD from war. That so much of that they experienced at war is exasperated because it built on top of childhood traumas that were never identified or addressed. Is that the experience that you have as you work with people?
Hugely. Military is one of the big populations that I treat, right, and that I work with. And definitely, I see that all the time. I mean, first of all, let's just say you have this young man. He grew up already in a extremely abusive, household, addictions present, whatever the case. And then you want to get out, right? You want to get out of that lifestyle and that living. What do? You join the military, right? You get out, but you carry those issues with you. Right. And then you're right. You carry trauma, but you're trying to move on. But I'll tell you straight off the bat, I didn't say this earlier, but trauma to me, and I share this with everybody, it's like trying to get a beach ball and you try to put it underwater and you try to hold it underwater. Eventually it's going to pop back up. Right. And for people, it pops up time and time again in their lives. And usually when they become parents, when they get married, or they experience some sort of trigger event. But going back to the military soldier, then you join the military, and then you let's just say you get married along the way, you have kids, you go out to war, you get deployed for a year, right? I mean, the effect of that is humongous when they come back, right? First of all, their sense of survival or safety is really out the door, right? There's triggers galore with loud sounds, fights or arguments. And so when they're not left treated, the effect on them is huge, and it destroys, and I've worked with this all the time, it destroys their marriage. It destroys themselves. And to the point where you see them later on, they're drinking, they're alcoholism, alcohol addictions, drug addictions, sex addictions start to develop and really expand and just exacerbate to the point where there's a complete sense of hopelessness and loneliness, and then they attempt to take their own life.
You using the story of the water beach ball that is put underwater and then it springs out. It so parallels what the writer of Hebrews says, that a person having a root of bitterness, it springs up. So it's a surprise. It can't be planned. It springs up after you think you have it controlled, and it troubles, it excites, it annoys, and then it will defile. And the word defile is like a tattoo. It creates this inking in your sense of self and identity. Again, another example of just how God knew all this before we ever learned it. So as you talk about this element of things springing up, of the traumas coming forward, sometimes within Christianity, with our most sincere heart of leadership, we try to tell people, just pray more, just fast more, just spend more time in the Bible. And the reality is that if you have one of these grief pockets, trauma pockets that are springing up and driving, you're not going to be able to discipline yourself around it or out of it.
Well, Pastor, I can explain the science behind that as well, too, that a lot of people don't realize. And when I explain it, it actually makes sense. Because this is why reading the Bible, let's just say, or praying doesn't become a very good advice that you would give to someone. Because when someone's in that fight, flight, freeze mode, that survival mode, right, where they're just really all limbic, and their prefrontal cortex, which is in charge of being able to reason and process, you see, that part of the brain, your prefrontal cortex, is shut down, actually.
Awesome.
Right, and they go straight into the limbic, into the brainstem, and they kind of reside there in their addictions and in their trauma. The whole ability to be able to process, reason, make sense, logic, that's all completely shut down. And that is why, if you're trying to minister to somebody who has been traumatized, or they've been through trauma, and you're telling them, like, okay, all you need to do is just pray and read more, and you'll be good. That part of the brain is not even functioning and working.
Yeah. I love that. That's a great example. When we typically tell people to pray or read your Bible more, what we're in essence doing is, and this is the way most people do it, pray or read their Bible. They pray as a transaction with God. God, this is what I need. Deliver me. I'm in pain. Deliver me. It is purely an order form on an electronic device that you send into the cloud to ask God to do something for you. That's what people do when they pray. When they read the Bible, generally they are in it for an academic experience. I'm reading to learn something. And they get frustrated because they're like, I don't even know what I'm reading. It doesn't seem to make sense in terms of what I'm supposed to be learning. But if a person was able to have a bigger perspective that you've just provided us with, and they were to pray with the goal of experiencing Jesus in their grief pocket, where they could have an interpersonal moment where I'm not getting fixed here. I'm not looking for some kind of answer that is a silver bullet moment. I'm looking for the lover of my soul to meet me in my pain and to sit with me in it, to be touched with the feeling of my infirmities, and to help me reprocess the memories. So at the deepest level of that root of grief, I can use truth, but truth is not aside from love. Grace and truth have to live together. And so if grace is not meeting me just by loving me and being power and grace of strength in my human weakness, if that's not happening, then the actual exercise of prayer or reading my Bible is doing nothing more than just me in a cognitive prefrontal cortex learning environment. And that, again, in our Christian environments is where we often leave people. Correct. We want them to just stay there. And so you're offering us a whole new way to think about that when we have been traumatized, yes, God wants us to reprocess it. And yes, there can be components of prayer and reading the Bible, but those components have to be vehicles for intimacy. They can't be vehicles of academics.
You're correct. And that's the part too that becomes very hard for ministers in the church, right? You're ministering to someone who's been through a traumatic event. You're trying to help them. You're trying to get them to this higher level of intellectual and cognitive function of their experience, and spiritually trying to get them to the level when they're not even there yet. They're just trying to survive. Trauma comes in, and the person is, every single cell in that person's body has been affected by the event. You're trying to come in from a cognitive standpoint when their body has already told them, I'm not safe, right? You picture this, the person gets upset, maybe they feel offended, the victim will get offended, they're upset, maybe they blow out, they get angry, and then the minister who's trying to reach out thinks, oh, you're just crazy, what is wrong with you, I can't help you, and pulls them away, pulls away, right? And then they get labeled, but really what you have is this, there's not this understanding of what is going on.
Yes. And as a pastor, that is a huge tool belt to know what's going on. Yes. And sometimes, in my past, in some of the tradition that I came from, it'd be, you just need more whatever. You need more anointing. You need more faith. You need more inner healing. You need to have some kind of activation on it that is all often academic. So sometimes when you see people in fear within Christianity, the answer has been, well, doesn't the Bible say that perfect love casts out fear? And the idea in the person saying that is that if you understand the concept, it'll fix the fear. Well, first of all, love is not a concept. Perfect love casting out fear is an experience of intimacy that is only digested or metabolized in the limbic system of the brain, which is the area of the brain that the trauma is residing in. And so intimacy has to be experiential. Perfect love casting out fear isn't a doctrine that I use to choke people off. It is actually something that I offer them. And the other side of that, or another part of that, is that intimacy from God is incarnated within humans. So when I tell somebody a cheap answer, the perfect love casts out fear, without meeting them with empathy and love and feeling it with them, I've actually short-circuited the very body of Christ that God's called us into.
In the psychology realm, I'm sure you've heard this, Pastor, the Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And so at the very bottom line, bottom fundamental level, it's meeting a person's physiological needs and their sense of safety and well-being. You can't do anything else until that bottom line, that bottom row is met, where there's the physical, the physiological needs, the sense of safety is there. Then you can be more effective as a minister. Because if you're trying to minister to them at, again, this higher degree of level functioning, and they don't feel safe, and their body's screaming at them, danger, 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 you ain't going to get very far.
Yeah. Talk about the triune brain a little bit, because it matches that. The brain stem and what it needs, the limbic system, what it needs. Share with us that.
So really when, it really is, when you start to go into the limbic part of the brain, you're really talking about survival. And when someone has gone through a traumatic event, what their body is screaming is, they want to be safe, right? And which is why the cortex at that point in time shuts down, right? And it goes straight to limbic, because it's a survival, right? It's a survival of human mankind for, centuries, where if we're in danger, let's just say if we see a gunman running to us to try to shoot us, right? We're not going to just stand there and go, what should I do? Right? No, we're going to run. Right? We're going to be like, we're going to get our loved ones and we're going to run, right? As fast as we can the other direction. Why? Because our limbic is saying, no, you're going to get killed, right? Yeah. And it's this way that God has created and made our brain to really survive situations, right? But like I said, when a person has gone through many events over and again, no longer can their brain conceptualize or understand what is safe, what is real, anymore. Yeah.
So much where we live, and as leaders, it's incredibly important to become efficient in this. I had a leader recently say to me, well, that's all above my pay grade. And they opted out of a learning experience in it. And they acted as though I'll refer that out. Well, here's what I would want to offer up from that is that person then needs to have a sober check-in about what they're actually owning. What they're saying is that I don't have a right to ever teach on human behavior again. I don't have any right to talk about living by faith. So if somebody's going to talk about living by faith, you can't talk about living by faith without understanding the circuits that drive it and how doubt or unbelief is a fear cycle that is seizing on people, and you can't just drill doctrine in to change that. Absolutely. You have to allow truth to meet the grief at its deepest story, not at the surface. If you have grief and just tell somebody to fear not, which that whole idea of fear not is so pushed to the extreme. Yes, God offers us the grace. When Jesus would say fear not, he's in that moment infusing the person with the ability to not fear. When you and I say it, often what we're doing is just trying to limit people and not really helping them understand that your whole fear circuit, and during Corona and COVID and all that's happened, the fundamental of anxiety is a God-given gift to us to help us innovate in times of chaos. It's Absolutely. To alert us to come online to say, I'm not going to sit here and do nothing. I'm going to address it. The beauty of what God offers us is in moments of anxiety where we innovate to create solutions to whatever the threat is, that when we take God at his word, it actually processes in the brain that now we've answered the anxiety. So there is a beauty and a wonder to it. But for us to fast forward past trauma, past grief, and act as though, no, that's what you nerds need to do off in an office somewhere with really desperate people. No, wait. If you don't understand the processing, it's going to impact every area of your life.
You bet. And Pastor, I want to make a very strong statement, and I'll be very unapologetic about it. But when you have a minister or a leader in a church who refuses to learn, who refuses to try to understand the heart of a human and what they've gone through and their experiences, or tries to push that up to other people because they feel that's above their pay grade, I'll be honest with you, and I'm going to say this, that person should do everyone a favor and step out of their role in their position.
I'm with you. And we are pro pastors, aren't we? We are pro leaders. We love the Church of Jesus. We love the Bible. We love that people have given their lives to it, but don't be a part of the problem. Be a part of the answer.
No,
and if you quit learning, I agree.
And Jesus, if you really look at, right, and you look all of New Testament, Jesus was our best model of being, loving, right? Not condemning. Right? And really bringing people to know him, right? We look at John 4, I believe, is the one where the Samaritan woman at the well, midday, ostracized, right? For her actions or behaviors, right? Jesus spoke truth to her, but yet also embraced her with that truth.
Yes.
And welcomed her in, And really, that's the model for us to follow. And it's really not rocket science. If you look at it very fundamentally, that if you really, even if you don't understand what trauma is, if you can just spend the time to just listen, just to be and hold space for that person to have their feelings and emotions, sometimes that's just half the battle in itself.
It is.
Always, as a minister, you don't always have to know all the answers.
Yeah. When the scripture says that speak the truth in love, I hear that quoted. I, over the years, have heard that quoted often. Well, you got to speak the truth in love. Well, why is it that I don't feel any love with your truth? I feel your truth. I don't feel your love. And I'm not sure your truth is coming from a place that's completely credible or accurate. Love has to have an experience, which means that I have to feel empathy. I have to feel compassion. I have to feel seen and known. If I'm not, in the environment of heart-to-heart attachment and connection, this idea of speak the truth now then just becomes a weight that you put on me, like the Pharisees put on people. It was, we don't care about who you are. We're not going to feel what you feel. We're just going to throw a bunch of quote unquote truth at you. And Jesus, he made some pretty profound statements around that. Well, let's talk about the therapies for a little bit. What are the types of therapy that's going to work best in helping people work through their trauma?
Very, very good question. I get asked this a lot as well, too. And I'm going to first say that, if someone is going out there and they're trying to find a therapist for themselves, my advice to them is, you really got to carefully do your homework and research into the background of the therapist. You want someone who is very well trained and, ideally certified and can really understand with trauma. There's a lot of people out there, unfortunately, who market themselves as their specialty is being trauma, but they actually have no training whatsoever. And so
wait. Because this is a highlight bullet point that I do find myself with my biases being frustrated by.
Yes.
When I have talked to some therapists, and I'm sure they do great work in areas, but they will put on their website, or if you go to Psychology Today and find them, they will say that they specialize in trauma treatment. And yet when you dig, if you actually had a conversation, many, which I have had conversations with, have had maybe an hour to 2 hours of trauma training in all of their master's program, and that's it. And my heart breaks around that. So I just want to emphasize that. So keep going. What do we look for? How do we get past this facade that they actually know something?
No, very good, very good. So yes, definitely you want to really be able to look and don't be afraid to ask questions, right? What type of training, what type of certification, what type of experience do they have specifically in treating this area, and sometimes I have people when they message me, I'm trying to inquire on training, sometimes my own potential upcoming patients, they'll ask me questions, or like, do you know who Bessel van der Kolk is? Or do you know Dr. Dan Siegel? Almost like testing me to know, am I well versed in the area or not, right? And because that's a clue as well to whether or not, right? First off the bat, right? If you're doing trauma treatment, you should know the big names in the industry.
Yes.
If not, that there's that's a flag right there. Yeah. Just like sex addiction work, for example, right? I bumped into lots of therapists who say, I work in sex addiction. And I'm like, okay, have you ever heard of Dr. Patrick Carnes? And they're like, who's that? Right. And then I know, well, okay, you're
oh my gosh, question, absolutely.
Right? Yeah, like how much you actually know, because that is the guru of sex addiction. And so, if you don't know that, then I really don't know what you actually know. Yeah. And so you have to do the careful homework of really asking questions and finding out what type of treatment modalities do you use, things like that. So going back to your earlier question, in my office, I'm very particular about the type of treatment that I use here, for me as an individual and for my counseling center as a whole. For myself, I am certified in 2 top-notch treatment models. They actually call it the gold standard of trauma treatment. The first one is EMDR, which stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And the other one is called, the acronym is TFCBT, and that stands for trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy. Why I choose those 2 is because it's been shown by research time and time again to be very efficient, effective in helping people to reduce down, if not completely diminish, their trauma symptoms.
Yeah.
Even up to 3 months, 1 year post-treatment.
Yeah. If somebody has the initial CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, but they don't have the initials TF in front of it, does that shift the gold standard?
Yeah, percentage-wise, they do. CBT is actually very good work, but TFCBT has components of CBT in it, but it's just that percentage-wise of effectiveness, you're talking about CBT in general. If you're using CBT to treat trauma, you might be looking at about maybe about a 50 to 60% effectiveness rate, right? Which is not bad if you're thinking about it. But when you take it up a notch, like EMDR, the effectiveness, research shown over and over again, is shown to be about 84 to 90% effective. TFCBT, comparatively speaking to CBT, effectiveness rate of TFCBT, time and time again, it's actually in the high end of 80% as far as success rate goes.
That's amazing.
And so when someone is trying to look for treatment, if you're going to pay the money and spend the time, go for, my opinion is, you go for the best.
Yes, yes.
This is an investment and time that you're doing to heal yourself, right?
Yeah.
And not just that, you heal yourself and you improve yourself. That's going to have effects also that will bleed on to your children, to your spouses, and to the church as well as a whole. So gold standard, EMDR, and TFCBT is truly the best, and which is why I've chosen those two to be my specialty areas.
And you are also a CSAT with the International Institute of Trauma and Addiction Professionals. CSAT is a certified sexual addiction therapist. And I know for me, and I want our audience to hear this, whenever I'm recommending for a person to find a therapist in their area, I'm like you. I would rather have somebody who is an expert at the deepest levels of human behavior, and then they can throttle back to my exact need. So I encourage whenever I am asking people to interview, and you can call a therapist anywhere and interview them, or come in and have a session. Often it's free if you'll just sit down and interview them and ask them what it is that they are certified in, and what is their background in areas of trauma. And even for me, I encourage people that have no addiction, but they have a trauma profile, to find a certified sexual addiction therapist, because I know that that person is going to understand way beyond what they're going to need. But because of their need, I know they'll be able to address it with very clear instruments, assessments, be able to dig into their life in a very effective kind of way. So I like to say CSAT, the initials CSAT, another initial series of EMDR. I love the TF-CBT. And then I like for them to have a deeper understanding of attachment. And so I like if they have had a background at some level of EFT, emotionally focused therapies, because at the very bottom of attachment is your wounds, and that's what shifted them. And so again, I wanted to verbalize that for our audience, because this is stuff that people don't know. Correct. And they ask me often, well, where should I go? How do you even find a therapist? And they're already, they don't want to go. Who wants to go to a therapist and work on your stuff? I mean, honestly, you have to be in a desperate energy place, because I know for me, I do therapy. I've been to therapists, and I'm one that I really want to do the work on my grief story. But then when it comes down to do the work on my grief story, it's like, maybe I can just organize around how to do this instead of just doing the work. So when somebody's already hesitant about doing the work on themselves, they don't need a bunch of other speed bumps. So for you to gift us with what to look for in a therapist is so helpful, so amazing. Talk to us a little bit about EMDR and what it does, what to expect when you're doing it.
Absolutely. So EMDR to me is, and EMDR is nothing new, Pastor. It's been around for like 30 something years. It's been shown time and time again to be very effective, like I mentioned earlier. EMDR, I'm personally myself, I'm a real skeptic. Like, I have to see it to believe it. Yeah, and EMDR was one of those things when I first heard about it, I was thinking, like, man, this sounds like a lot of hocus pocus. Is this for real or what? Right? I was kind of thinking that in my head,
I'm totally with you.
Yeah, and and I was questioning it, but then the curious side of me as a clinician, I'm like, oh, let's check into this, right? And it was been something I was actually curious about for years before I went into it. EMDR, and this is my version of understanding of it, is that when someone goes through again a traumatic event in their life. Again, your brain tries to survive the situation, and so parts of it shuts down, parts of it cannot comprehend, cannot process. And what happens is, and according to Dr. Francine Shapiro, right, some of these events, what happens is it really gets actually lodged and almost like stuck in the brain.
Yeah.
And so what EMDR actually does is it actually helps through eye movements or tapping, actually helps the brain to actually process that memory. The beautiful thing about EMDR, comparatively speaking to TFCBT, is that the person actually doesn't necessarily have to go out there and share every single detailed event of the traumatic event. The brain is actually, in those sessions, the one that's actually processing through everything, which is very fascinating. Yeah. And the person is really present in the moment, in the here and now, and having this complete space to let their brain go through and process what has happened to them using bilateral stimulation, and people get scared, but here in our office, we have a light bar, I have hand buzzers, I have also, the kind of like tones that they can use. I do eye movements as well too. Anything that can cause that bilateral stimulation, the brain to move left and right, so that whatever information has been lodged there is now processed and released. And what the person actually finds at the end is, once they process through that, it's almost like they've been set free. That intrusive memory and thought no longer affects them anymore. The most fascinating thing about EMDR is it's so different from the traditional old school Freudian type of talking psychotherapy that we think about, which someone can go in that type of therapy for years and still not get their issues really addressed. EMDR is short term. Really, you can accomplish phenomenal results in just 6 to 12 sessions.
And I have experienced people that I have sent to do EMDR. Some have had significant physical symptoms in their body, pain in their ears and so on, and have gone to some of the major clinics of America and have gotten no help, and send them to a few sessions of EMDR and their symptoms go dramatically down.
Right.
I've seen people who had, one person had an intense fear of snakes. When I say an intense fear, would get nauseated by the thought. That's it, just the thought. Get nauseated by the thought. And one treatment of EMDR it's radical. And it is, again, I'm like you, when I first heard about it, I'm like, this just sounds way too. But then I read Francine's book and saw the neuroscience behind it. I began to understand how the brain functions. And on a very simplistic level, this is very simplistic. If a person ever goes and sits at the beach and sees waves coming in and it feels like beach therapy, like it's just something about that calms them, that is on a very low level what EMDR is doing to the brain. But it's EMDR is opening the limbic gates so that work can be done where the memory files have been put. It is an amazing thing.
No,
well, quickly, yeah.
And I tell folks, EMDR, this is how I kind of, I share with my patients who come in, is that to me, EMDR, it's like having those stuck drain pipes in your home. And I come in with Drano and I just pour that whole sucker bottle in there. And I just take it all out. We take it all out. We clear out all those pipes, right?
That's
and
a great example.
That's how I see EMDR.
Yeah, it's so cool. Well, real quick, hit TFCBT and kind of what a person would expect with it. And then I am curious, which I'll ask again in a moment, but if a person wanted to have you to be a coach or a therapist, what are the guidelines around a Zoom experience? Is that even possible? And we'll pick it up from there. But tell us a little bit about TFCBT and what a person would expect.
Absolutely. I've been very fortunate, Pastor, because I've actually, TFCBT is nationwide, right? It's incredible as far as effectiveness. And I was very fortunate to where I'm nationally certified in this model of treatment. And I was actually trained by the developers themselves. So they were actually my mentors and my teachers. And so that is doctors Judith Cohen, Anthony Manarino, and Esther Deblinger. And so Dr. Cohen and Manarino are actually out in Pittsburgh. And so Allegheny Hospital. So they actually were the ones who actually trained me directly and mentored me through the whole process of learning. So I really have learned from the best. And so I can speak very much with TFCBT. And so TFCBT is, in my opinion, probably one of the most well-diverse, and also yet, even though it's a modular treatment, very flexible in what a clinician can use to treat trauma.
Yeah.
Very different from EMDR in the sense where there's a foundation that's laid first strongly on psychoeducation, on safety, and as well as understanding, typical CBT things like understanding thoughts and feelings, body, right? Which is very important because trauma, the effect of trauma is not just the brain, right? It's really your entire body that you have to treat. And so TFCBT recognizes that. And the beautiful thing about TFCT is because its primary focus is actually for children and adolescents, although I've used it for adults, you really bring the families alongside treatment as well too. So as you're working with the trauma victim, you're also helping the parents and understanding them. Because we know this, when a child goes through a traumatic event, it's not just the child who's been traumatized, it's also the parents as well too, or the caregivers, right? So really when I'm healing the child, I'm not just healing the child, I'm actually working and I'm healing the whole family unit as a whole. And so as I work with them with TFCBT, the beauty of TBC is this one portion that's called trauma narrative. And what a trauma narrative is an opportunity for that person to be able to share their experience of what they've been through. And this is where the beauty of TBC comes in, where it is very flexible because the person chooses how they want to share and express their story. So here in my office, when I do TFCBT, we might write, we might use all songs only, just songs only, dance, art, for them to express and share their story in their way that makes sense for them. Or even dance could be another option, for example. But again, it's really the same effect at the end when they can come in and they can share their experience, what they've been through, the hell they've been through, everything. And not just that, but they can connect it with the maladaptive thoughts that came out of that event, right? The person is now made whole out of treatment as well too.
That is so good.
Yeah, TFCBT is beautiful. It's also short-term as well too. I would say about 12 to 24 sessions, depending on the age of the child. But TFCBT is fascinating because I've done TFCBT work with children as young as 3 to 4 years old.
Amazing.
Up until adulthood years. So it's a very, very flexible treatment that you can adapt and modify. If you're a therapist and you're out there, the kind of cool thing is TFCBT has an online training that's free that people can Google for 10 hours. It's not a certification. It's more like just kind of a beginning understanding of how to actually do the treatment, but they can actually get CEUs online and they can receive 10 hours of free training online with TFCBT.
Wow. Oh, I love that.
Yeah, the adult version of TFCBT is actually called CPT, which stands for Cognitive Processing Therapy. But very similar, except one of the key difference I think with CPT is there's a segment in there that's called where you're making meaning out of your experience of what you've been through. Although I would say TFCBT, that's also incorporated as well too, because I help the child or the teen to also make sense of what they've actually been through.
Yeah. I just am fascinated by the resilience of the human brain, the body, to be able to reprogram and to find wholeheartedness. Well, can people work with you across state lines via Zoom or another online solution?
Unfortunately, I can't, only because of our licensure laws, but people are welcomed. They can go to my website, edwinareyes.com, and that's spelled EDWINAREYES.com, because I do have lots of video clips and a few articles on there that people can look up different topics, different areas that I speak about in our center's TV segments here locally. And they can also find me on Facebook as well as Instagram as well too. So Instagram, Edwina Reyes MFT is my Instagram name. And folks can ask me questions, and I do a lot of informational videos as well too, different things on trauma, addiction, sex addiction that people can find. And that might be useful for them.
Oh, absolutely is. And your licensure does allow you to treat people who come to Hawaii. So there may be people who will be like, I could go to Hawaii and be treated. So, there's always that.
Yes, but folks are always welcome to email me or message me out. And if they are trying to get help on how to find or who might be good in their area, folks are very welcome to contact me, and I'd be glad to help them.
You're such a beautiful soul. Thank you again, Edwina, for being a part of our Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. And I look forward to having you on again real soon.
Thank you, Pastor.
Thank you guys for joining us. We are so blessed that you were with us. You might be wondering, what's next? Consider attending one of our personal discovery experiences. It's a 2-hour event, or come to one of our retreats where we dig down into your story and give quite a bit of psychoeducation as to why you do what you do. You can also subscribe to this podcast at any podcast provider in YouTube. Go to redinkrevival.com to find out all the unique opportunities to grow your life and your leadership. And while you're there, again, sign up for our e-newsletter that'll hit your inbox the first of each month with a powerful blog post and keep you up to date with all that we're doing. Everything we're building is to resource you to be a wholehearted leader. I'd love for you to be a part of our tribe. And I can't wait till our next episode. I'm glad that you're with us today. We'll see you next time.